Real families, real farms, real food. Welcome to Arizona Agriculture Connection with Maricopa County Farm Bureau. My name is Nicole Clements, Executive Director, and I'll be your host. Maricopa County Farm Bureau is the voice of agriculture in a community that thrives on the dichotomy of urban and rural agriculture operations. This podcast is a home for farmers, ranchers, food lovers, prospective agriculturalists, and those looking to connect the food on their plate with the farm that it came from. As we take an inside look at agriculture in Arizona, we will delve into topics like ag technology, policy, food preparation, and everything in between. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform with new episodes every Wednesday. Arizona Agriculture Connection is hosted by Maricopa County Farm Bureau and sponsored by Paloma Ready Mix and Materials, a proud supporter of agriculture and our communities. Be sure to subscribe and share your favorite episodes with your friends. For more interactions, follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Maricopa County FB. Now let's discover some Arizona agriculture. Welcome back, Arizona Aggies, to another episode of Arizona Agriculture Connection. This week, we are blessed to have economist from American Farm Bureau, Danny Munch. So welcome, Danny. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nicole.
Absolutely. Well, why don't you start with a little introduction, kind of tell us a little bit about your journey and how you wound up there in DC?
Yeah, so I'm an economist on the American Farm Bureau Federation public policy team. There's 5 of us when we're fully staffed, and we each cover different portfolio issues. My portfolio currently covers dairy markets and policy, specialty crop markets, public lands, invasive endangered species, disaster assistance, and a number of other issues. I've been with Farm Bureau about 4 years. Prior to that, I was a protein commodity analyst, tracking different prices of crops over in New Jersey. And I'm a Northeasterner at heart. I grew up in New England, East Lyme, Connecticut. I was a Yukon Husky, which, we got knocked out of the tournament this go around, but we did win the last 2. So I guess we have to give somebody else a chance. I went to Yukon for livestock management and policy and resource economics. Don't have really that big of an ag background, but I did get sucked into 4-H as a little kid. My parents aren't farmers, but got sucked into 4-H showing cattle and chickens and never really left ag from there. Then went to Cornell University for agricultural food economics, focusing on dairy pricing economics, and in between interned at Farm Credit and in Congress for Connecticut's 2nd Congressional District, working on different policy issues. So always have been very passionate about issues impacting our farmers and ranchers. It's been great at Farm Bureau to be able to venture into issues I wasn't as familiar with growing up in the Northeast. My state, Connecticut, 90 miles wide, 50 miles tall. So when you go out to Idaho, Arizona, Utah, and you get on the interstate and you look at your GPS and it says for 150 miles, continue straight, it's like, well, that's my whole state. And you can see it all right there in a wide open field. So looking at how, the federal government owns so much land out there and how that sort of relates to how folks operate ranches and businesses has become really interesting to me, and where I put some of my time and analytics into as well, beyond all the, farm bill analyses, especially crops, all the other things that we look at.
Yeah, I think for me, I grew up a livestock kid. So, we raised livestock in the Midwest. So the economist part of it is not really my strong suit. So I'm looking forward to, learning a lot today, picking up a little.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely filled my parents' house up with a bunch of random animals. They're both engineers and not farmers. So when I came home with a different type of, pheasant, duck, goose every couple of weeks to add to my 4-H project, they were totally thrilled.
4-H is a gateway into agriculture and maybe, like collection of animals. There's always, well,
Right.
it's just a little duck or it's just a little chicken. Like we've got room.
Yeah, and then you end up with 30 birds in the backyard. My, not a big plot of land and leasing cows out of the next door neighbor's little beef farm. So that's where I kind of started things off.
Ah, that's a great place to start. All right, well, let's dive into it. Maybe let's touch a little bit on what is, been a very popular topic for some time, the Farm Bill. And it's popular because we currently don't have a new one. So what does that look like, from your end, and what do you see that can really provide some insight as to what is going to impact our producers and our consumers?
Yeah, so usually farm bills are supposed to last 5 years. And right now we're still working off of the 2018 farm bill going on into 2025. So our 2018 farm bill was extended at the end of the year last year till September 30th of this year. The difference between this time and the last time it was extended is that there's a lot of orphan programs that were not funded. So a lot of important things to our specialty crop growers like the citrus disease research grants. You have things like the feral swine eradication pilot program, which feral hogs becoming a bigger and bigger problem each year as they move their way up the United States, destroying, millions and millions of dollars of crops. All these different research grants are not funded currently that were originally funded. So some of your base programs are still there, dairy margin coverage, ARC PLC, which ARC and PLC enrollment deadlines coming up here April 15th. So those are still in existence up until September 30th, but they haven't been updated. We're still working off of outdated reference prices, and that's, those outdated metrics and formula factors are really what's setting our farmers back right now without a new and enhanced farm bill. We're using prices that haven't been adjusted for inflation with the new costs of production within a lot of those programs. So without higher reference prices, things don't really trigger as often and don't provide the cushion that farmers need to really make ends meet, especially as we enter sort of a time period where trade and other things might really vastly undercut farmers' bottom lines. So we are in a unique spot now, though, where do we move forward in terms of politically? They did pass a budget resolution earlier this year, which jumpstarts something called a reconciliation process, where you don't need 60 votes to really pass something related to revenue or budget allocation. So you can really pass something with a simple majority in the Senate and the Congress, as long as it's related to sort of funding. So that means that it is possible for Congress to pass some of these bigger ticket farm bill items like, SNAP spending, the nutrition spending, the commodity programs, ARC PLC, dairy margin coverage. It is possible that they could get something done on reconciliation, but that would sort of split up the farm bill because now you have the focus on these funding and revenue pieces, which are obviously very important to our farmers. But then a lot of your other language piece of the farm bill, things like we've been pushing for mandatory and audited surveying of dairy processing plants to make sure that the way that dairy and milk is priced under the federal order system is fair to farmers. And that's not something that could happen in the reconciliation package, for example. So there is a chance that some of those items get moved in a reconciliation process. Otherwise, chances, very up in the air in terms of getting a full farm bill done. The political dynamics right now and why nothing really happened in a full farm bill last year is really the discussion about nutrition. A lot of folks don't realize this, but nutrition makes up 85% of the farm bill, all in that supplemental nutrition assistance program, SNAP. And there's sort of two perspectives here. One adjusts automatically from year to year. So as the price for an average family of four to feed their family goes up with the cost, the Thrifty Food Plan, which sets that the costs fundamentals in SNAP, also increases. So we saw during COVID that increase exponentially, and that has continued to sort of adjust upward. The farm programs don't update automatically, so farmers don't have that ability to see those same increases in their programs. So on the Democrat side, they really want to continue to see those increases in the future so that SNAP is well funded in their opinion. On the Republican side, they want to rein in that future spending and put a cap on those future increases in SNAP. And Democrats are calling that a cut to spending, while the Republicans are saying it's not. So you really have that political dynamic that's not allowing anything to happen on the farm program side of things. And we don't really have enough of Republicans don't have enough of a majority in Congress to pass anything without Democrats. They also have folks within their own party who don't normally support a farm bill. So in order to get the votes needed, we need both parties to come together and really figure something out. And until that nutrition issue gets fixed, that outcome is really up in the air. So a long-winded response, but something might happen in reconciliation. If not, this nutrition deal really has gotten to get figured out before we move forward.
I know here in Arizona, we keep, kind of a close eye on the milk marketing orders side of it. Dairy is our number one commodity. Kind of goes back and forth between dairy and beef, but, we have about 200,000 dairy cows and about 7 dairy processors in the state. So a lot of that is really important to kind of our local food supply chain, which not everybody thinks of Arizona as a dairy state, but, we've got plenty of them here. So.
Yeah, and that's sort of another piece of this puzzle too, because in the dairy industry, we just went through this whole federal milk marketing order hearing where, USDA, all these stakeholders testified on how can we make the formulas and how dairy farmers are paid better. And one of the, things that we had been pushing for at American Farm Bureau was for make allowances, which is basically a deduction out of the milk formula that accounts for the cost of processors to convert fluid milk into your further processed products like cheese, butter. That costs processors something to do. So there's a deduction within the formula that reduces what dairy farmers get paid. And the scary thing is that that's politically set through this hearing process. So USDA digests a lot of information from stakeholders and sets that number that becomes basically regulation. And if they set that number too high, you're artificially reducing the price that dairy farmers receive for their milk at a number that's too high. So you're not giving dairy farmers the full value of their milk. So the one thing we've been trying to push for in a farm bill or in other language is mandatory and audited surveying of processors' costs, which would mean that this metric, this make allowance metric, would be based on a full mandatory data sample of what processors' costs really are versus numbers that have been based on voluntary surveys that, processors could have, chose to submit their data, but then that usually ends up being skewed towards folks that might want to share that data versus really efficient processors who don't really have any benefit from sharing their data. So that's something that we've really been pushing for as a dairy industry. We hope to have it done before the hearing process. That did not happen. We're still kind of waiting for legislation now. And ultimately, dairy farmers are going to have to, feel the brunt of these higher make allowances come June 1st of this year when those regulations go into effect. So it really brings things together of how, a farm bill doesn't get done. We don't get all priorities in there. It trickles into other industries that might not really, federal order system usually operates outside of the farm bill, but can be enhanced by it. So another example there.
So kind of jumping from, one hot topic to the next. So we look at a lot of the tariff discussion that we've heard in the media, and a lot of, I think from the consumer side, they hear that and they don't really some really understand that who is going to be paying these tariffs in the end, right? Are they going to see it at the grocery shelves? Is it going to be the farmer? Is it going to be a third party? What do you think would be maybe the most solid piece of information about regarding the tariff situation and what that is going to look like in reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And obviously there's a tons of nuance behind how that's looked at and applied. One of the best statistics I like to look at is that Canada, China, and Mexico, which are really the top three markets that the administration has focused on recently. Mexico's our number one export market for ag products, $30.3 billion. Canada's number two, $28.3 billion, and China's number three, $24.7 billion. So you're looking at putting tariffs on our biggest three ag export markets, which means vastly going to disrupt our ability to farm for farmers to access those markets. And then the retaliatory tariffs really might go and impact our consumers. And where it's really going to impact is items that, we're not producing as much in the United States and we really need to acquire from other countries. So on the food side of things, a lot of your more tropical fruits, specialty crops that might come into the country, there has been arguments there, tariffs do help some specialty crop growers where there's competition between those markets, say coming from Mexico with tomatoes or something like that. In other places, consumers are going to be hurt when there's no domestic supply and there's, basically this monetary value slapped on top of what's coming in. And then those companies have to sort of disperse those costs to the buyers. So consumers face increases there. A lot of vehicles that are purchased in this country are not American built or made. They come in from overseas. So things like those products start to see an increase in price there. So there's going to be differences between how these products are produced and if there's domestic supply. But in a lot of these areas where we just don't have the infrastructure to build these products, or a large percentage of our supply comes from those countries, consumers are going to see some of those increases in prices. Obviously, there are a lot of countries that place tariffs on our products. And, reciprocal tariffs on some of these countries doesn't always seem like a bad idea, especially in markets like India, where they've been very protective over their own markets and have sort of blocked, American products and other countries' products from entering those markets. So breaking down trade barriers is obviously really important, but it really needs to be put in perspective of how detrimental some of these impacts can have on our farmers' access to markets and ability to move product. U.S. producers are the best producers in the world. They produce vastly more than what U.S. consumers can consume. So we need to move those products to overseas mouths and have access to those markets. So, there's obviously benefits that could be made in taking down some trade barriers, but we do hope that everything is really looked into detail before this negatively impacts our producers once again, like they did back in 2018, 19, 20.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to dive into a little bit more of, kind of your specialty there at AFBF. When we look at the public land situation, Arizona's 38.5% federal lands within our borders here. So, what does that look like, from an agriculture perspective, and how does that change how we operate as agriculturalists in Arizona?
Yeah, and this is sort of one of those pieces I just find really interesting is, with that much federally owned land, the access to the federal land and those resources really becomes vital to a lot of ranchers' ability and farmers' abilities to succeed, right? So a lot of our ranchers, you're raising livestock on BLM land, Forest Service land, each and every day, rotating them off of that onto public lands. You're using both the forage on these public and private lands to ultimately create a marketable beef product, wool product, or other sort of ruminant product that you sell. Could end up in the Midwest once it reaches feedlot or whatever, but where you're utilizing these more marginal lands owned by the federal government to create a product that's beneficial to consumers across the country. And one of the things that we've looked at is and have been having to deal with is under the Biden administration, the Bureau of Land Management looked at sort of creating this other type of lease, a conservation lease. There was a lot of nuance to what it would do and how it would be defined. But for instance, perhaps a company could use a lease and no longer allow grazing to sort of offset some of their, environmental or to prove some of their environmental goals. There's a lot of nuance to how that would work, but it created a lot of nerves on our end of how that would be implemented and would it restrict public lands grazing. So we kind of took it upon ourselves to say, we really need to show the value of public lands grazing to not only consumers, but also vastly legislators, other stakeholders across the country. So one of the things that we wanted to look at was, and I sort of had three areas that we looked into, was what is the direct value of the meat and the wool that's coming off of these animals attributable to public lands forage? Because we know a lot of that meat's coming off of private lands that shipped in feed too, but what is just the value of the beef coming from public lands forage? And USDA has actually done some research on this, and it was about $1 billion each year of beef product, goat and sheep product comes off of those public lands. In Arizona, for instance, it was $54 million. And again, that's just this very base level, which is often starting a lot of our cow-calf pairs off. It's often starting as, the first beginning phase of the cattle production system. So that, $1 billion might not seem like a lot broadly, but it really spurs and sustains a lot of those rural communities. The second thing that we looked at was ecosystem services. We know that grazing cattle on these open lands helps in their management, helps reduce fire risk. It helps with, promoting perennial grass growth, which helps with soil health, water filtration, air health, even maintaining environments for some of your endangered and threatened species. So, University of Wyoming, they put it upon themselves to try to model some of those benefits as what is the total benefits to consumers across the country that public lands grazing supplies. And what they found is $3.7 billion worth of ecosystem services coming through public lands grazing. That comes to about $20 an acre going back to consumers in urban areas who might just be eating beef or otherwise might not even be eating the product, but are benefiting from the services that, just moving cattle around out west is providing to those land areas. In Arizona, it was $244 million in ecosystem services each year. And the last one that I really wanted to look at, which I think is often overlooked, is public lands ranchers are providing services in what they do sort of by managing the lands free of charge to constituents across the country. You're going out there maintaining fence line, maintaining the countryside, all that sort of thing, which if you weren't there, the federal government would have to do that, right? It would cost the taxpayer. So I sort of modeled using some Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, what the average cost for, a conservation scientist and some technicians if they were to replace a ranching family and some of their farm hands with those salaries. And when you multiply that out, there were about 17,000 active leases in the United States. If you multiply that out, $3.25 billion it would cost the US federal government to replace what ranchers are doing free of charge for the American people just by managing the lands themselves. And that was $138 million in Arizona, went up to almost $700 million in Montana. So many benefits coming from the folks that choose to utilize and manage these lands. This is their way of life. It's a cultural thing. It sustains so many of these rural communities. And, just so important to make sure the access to these lands is maintained in those states where federal lands play such a big role in those local economies.
Yeah, those are some big numbers
Yeah.
and kind of really shows the highlight of the impact that we have, as farmers and ranchers. And I know, especially, we're in Maricopa County in Arizona. So, right in the heart of Phoenix, we've got the Valley of the Sun and, all of our urban population. But Maricopa County is one of the, I think, fourth largest county in the United States. And we run the gamut from rural to urban. We've got anything and everything in between. It's hard sometimes, I think, for those in the urban settings to truly understand, how impactful agriculture is, not only for, the food on the shelves, but to the environment around them and to their state. And to kind of be able to put some numbers to that, as an economist, that's your job, but it really helps, I think, showcase the importance of what we do here.
Right. And, over time, the perception of ag obviously changes so much as more and more people live in urban areas. And that's something that we keep hearing in ag over and over is, that disconnect between urban America and rural America. But the messaging through all these sort of false narratives and these documentaries that are just not representing agriculture correctly forces this perception that's just vastly incorrect. So many people thinking that, cattle and calves are never out running across open land out west is just so vastly wrong about most cattle starting in sort of those situations on open pastures and open lands, and really how much of a benefit those sort of actions are towards ecosystems if managed correctly. So the partnership that farmers and ranchers have with conservationists all across the country and rangeland management officials all getting along towards the same goals often isn't known about by consumers that that's even happening. So many farmers are working hard to obviously maintain the land that they live on and their family is based on, and they're eating and consuming a lot of the products they grow generally. So obviously they want those products to be safe and sound as well. So really just everyone needs perspective, and part of that's us telling our story as well.
Absolutely. I know we've had a bit of a spotlight on it here in Maricopa County specifically. Arizona is an open range state, and currently we have some cattle that are making their way into urban areas. So it's been in the headlines a little bit recently, and I think just from the public's perception of it, we've had to maybe share that story more often than not about, we have fences, but it's also the responsibility for you to fence out cattle because of, the regulation that we have in our state and the importance of that regulation and what it does to impact our community beyond, maybe cows wandering through some neighborhoods.
Right, right. I mean, balancing the burden is really important in agriculture. Obviously, this is in a lot of cases a natural resource, right? And even just if you have your private property, you're talking about these open ranching areas, but everybody has a responsibility to helping to maintain the industry and support their food system. And I think that a lot of times folks take that for granted, and then, farmers are bearing the brunt of the regulatory burden and often, targeted by other efforts when a lot of folks' own actions within urban areas are might be wrongly pressuring farmers and they don't even know about it. So I think it's often good when that sort of happens and ag breaks into the urban world a little bit because it brings a highlight. Hopefully there's not as much negative reaction, but I do think, folks seeing cattle walk into an urban area might not always be a bad thing. I think it brings the attention, like you said, and hopefully will show like some of the heartache that farmers are dealt with and ranchers in that area.
Yeah, I think it provides us a good opportunity to share the story and to, help people understand that even though you may not see the ag every day right outside your window, it's still there. It's still providing and taking care of you and your family. And, that's all our farmers and ranchers are really trying to do is provide for others. And it's an opportunity for us to highlight some of that. So
Right. No, it's kind of funny, but it's a good opportunity.
yeah, I had someone mail me a newspaper that it was on the front page of the newspaper, pictures of cows in people's front yards. So it's kind of funny. You have to laugh about it a little bit, but again, an opportunity for us to be present and share that story and, help people understand a little bit more. Because I think one thing that we found, especially in the last couple years or so, people are ultra curious about where their food is coming from. And they want to be able to make that connection from the shelf at the store to the farmer. And I think it's a great opportunity for us in agriculture to be able to make that connection for them and help them kind of put those puzzle pieces together and really understand where it's coming from.
Yeah, and I've seen, quite a big uptick in social media use by farmers that are, willing to do that. Obviously, that's not everybody's forte, but when you're able to have a dairy farmer go up there and show the day to day how milking works, how, cow calves raising work, that, pregnant heifer, that sort of thing, how feeding works, it really makes that difference in what those viewers' perception is of farming and the industry more broadly. So it's really creative how a lot of folks have gotten and with social media, and I think that's going to be a big benefit. But then you also have the other side of that, right, where it could be easily hijacked by folks that want to show things that are just not right. So making sure we're the loudest voice out there and being the most reputable source for that information and balance is super important, but such an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of sneak it into the dairy side of it there. I know, that's another thing that you're focused on. And obviously, dairy is huge here in Arizona. And my experience comes from the dairy side of the industry as well. So that's kind of more probably easier for me to grasp onto as well. But so, what would be some information that you could share from the economist side of it about the dairy industry and how that impacts us here in Arizona?
Yeah, well, right now, obviously, a lot of the uncertainty in the dairy industry is with tariffs, right? We produce too much milk in the country for what our consumers consume, and we need access to Canada, Mexico, Southeast Asia, Europe to move a lot of those further processed dairy products and sustain those prices. And we've seen decent prices over the past few years for our farmers after coming off of a period of very low lows and that post-COVID volatility. But there's going to be a lot of risk there with sort of the tariff situation. So once we figure out what happens, administration does follow through with some of these items, which by the time this airs will likely be known. But that's going to be a big piece. But one of the market areas where I've been sort of looking at recently was sort of, and it's been talked about a bunch recently, is the beef on dairy and dairy farmers starting to use more and more beef genetics in their heifers as the supply of cattle sort of goes down and down, dating back to, drought across the West a few years ago, the Midwest, Nebraska, Kansas, your big cattle states felt a lot of drought conditions and they liquidated a lot of cattle. And then the prices skyrocketed up. And that sort of led towards a positive feedback loop of moving even more cattle towards feedlots. And just recently in the newest cattle report, we saw, cattle on feed drop for the first time. I think it was 18% year over year drop for the first time in many years. So maybe that's a signal that folks are finally starting to retain some and will build back up their production, but we're still a long ways away from a higher beef supply. And because of that, dairy farmers have started to go, well, hey, there's actually two markets that I can work in here. You have the milk market and you have this beef market that if I use this genetics, and now we have the technology that folks can use beef genetics on their herds pretty regularly. If you utilize these genetics, you can have a larger animal, better feed conversion ratios, better marbling. The packers like them better. You can get, I've saw premiums 350 to over $700 a head for these beef on dairy crosses. Help balance the beef supply a little bit. You're never going to really offset all the decline we've seen, but really allow dairy farmers to get sort of an extra revenue stream. And on the milk market side of things, you sort of create a buffer between what dairy farmers used to do, which is when milk prices are high, they would add cows, and when milk prices are low, they would add cows. That's always how the joke goes. Now, when you're sort of looking at these two markets, you say, well, the beef market's really high right now. Let's retain some of my heifers and breed them with beef genetics. You can't now immediately use those for pure Holsteins or whatever other dairy cow you're using. And that sort of creates its own buffer against the ability of the industry to increase milk production as quickly as it used to, and might actually help support better dairy and milk prices in the future. Obviously, that's all going to base on if there's still demand in the marketplace with tariffs and everything. But it does sort of create this risk management within the dairy market. I think the last statistic that I saw, 72% of dairy farmers are utilizing beef genetics in their programs. And one of the units that we used to look at is semen sales. That's increased from 1.2 million units back in 2010, and now we're up over 9.4 million units, with 7.2 million of those being used on dairy cows. So folks are definitely getting into it in the dairy industry. It said 72%. and it's looking to be an opportunity to sort of diversify income and hedge against risk.
Yeah. I think it's a new opportunity. I mean, not necessarily a new opportunity, but an opportunity for dairy farmers to, kind of embrace that diversification because that's not always been a solid option for them.
Right. And it's funny because one of my coworkers who's been at Farm Bureau much longer than I have, I won't share his age, but he popped in, he's like, this whole beef on dairy thing, that's just called dual purpose. And we used to do that all the time, 50 years ago. And it's like, yeah, breeds used to be used for beef and, beef and milk. And now as technology got better with genetics, we focus on just having really good dairy cows and just having really good beef cows. And now there's a market again for having this cross that has better beef. So there's other efforts in sort of the dairy policy realm that we're kind of looking at. Obviously, without a farm bill, some of the dairy margin coverage changes that we wanted haven't been done. We wanted to update production history. Right now, farmers are still working on 2011 to 2013 production history. There was an ability to also use 2019 at one point. We're looking to move to every 5 years, you can update your production history using a 3-year rolling average. Also increasing that tier one coverage cap right now is 5 million pounds, which we know most farms are up over 8 million pounds. So increasing that to about 6 million pounds. So give a little bit of flexibility there and protection under dairy margin coverage. You also have the nutrition side of things where, kids in schools still don't have access to whole milk in their schools. And we've been very supportive of Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, which D.T. Thompson, chairman of the House Ag Committee, who's also on the Education and Workforce Committee, which has jurisdiction over child nutrition, has been very supportive of. And we're starting to see that move. It was blocked last year by the previous Senator Stabenow. But now we have a Democrat leader on the Senate side, Amy Klobuchar, who has sponsored that bill in the past and is very supportive of that, and also coming from a dairy state. So there might be some opportunities to get whole milk back in schools. That's something legislatively we're looking at. Also, the Dairy Pride Act, we're still in a limbo phase with FDA where they released a draft guidance on the use of dairy terms on plant-based products. And they were basically said that plant-based products could use dairy terms on their products. That was basically FDA's draft guidance. And they could voluntarily put a health disclosure if it was different than milk or not. Not mandatory, a voluntary disclosure if it was different than milk. And what product company would voluntarily put that their product is worse than milk on their item? That seems pretty silly. So we commented heavily against that and are still waiting for final guidance out of FDA. Obviously, the administration has changed, so there could be some prioritization changes. But the Dairy Pride Act would basically force FDA to follow their own standard of identity that they have on the books for milk and other dairy products. And again, we have broad support across the ag leaders on both the Democrat and Republican side. So that's something that potentially could move, especially as we sort of enter the phase of midterm elections. That might be another item that moves.
I know we've on some different topics, not just dairy related, but we're almost in a holding pattern to just kind of see what's happening at that federal level before we see any action taken, that will impact. And I know here in Arizona, we've lost some of our USDA grants that were available to, some of our produce producers and things that they were a significant amount of their business relied on each year. And it's, people are searching for answers, the producers, the consumers alike. It's hard to provide an answer because it almost feels like we are in this holding pattern and we have to wait and see kind of how stuff shakes out before we have any solutions or advice.
Right. Earlier in the administration, the first 2 weeks came through and it was like something new every hour that was shaking up the news. And I was like, we couldn't even keep up with what was coming out. And then obviously all of our members across the country reaching out for some clarity. But some of those conservation contracts, what being frozen and whether or not farmers we'd be paid for those. We've been assured, and Secretary Brooke Rollins has come into our office, spoken with our board, that any contract that was, outstanding and signed would be honored and paid for. And we have started to see some of that money go out the door. But obviously, some of the reprioritization of certain issues, like moving away from some of the climate rhetoric and those climate programs that our farmers, some of our members were looking forward to using some of those money on innovation and have already, thought that this was an agreed upon amount of money and thought that this would be incoming. Those sort of situations are still kind of up in the air, and we're waiting to get more clarity on how that will move forward. Obviously, there was that $30 billion in disaster assistance that was passed at the end of last year with the Farm Bill extension, 10 billion economic aid, primarily for the row crop producers. And then you got $20 billion coming for disaster assistance. We still don't have a lot of clarity over how the disaster assistance will be distributed, but I'm, assuming much of the drought that occurred out in Arizona, some of those farmers are going to benefit from those payments. So making sure we're working hard to make sure that whatever system USDA uses with disaster system assistance doesn't leave farmers falling through the gaps, and making sure that, it's actually adequate funding this time. Last time, because of the low amount of money that was allocated, farmers received, less than 10% of any of their losses. And this was already 2 years delayed. So we are working hard to try to make sure that the voice in the new administration for the farmer is there. We've been assured by some of the staff, and right now there's still a lot of gaps within the agencies in terms of staff. So as they're filling out this staff in the agencies with folks that were in the administration last time that, all these different trade associations, Farm Bureau have relationships with, hopefully communication will be a little bit more streamlined, and we'll be able to even better represent folks in, situations where contracts might not be being honored, or grants that we thought were going to receive aren't being received. And obviously a lot of these orphan programs in the Farm Bill that weren't continued, bringing up to them how important those are to our producers, and hopefully getting those extended somehow.
It's a lot of hard work to keep up with everything. Our producers are very appreciative of everything that happens kind of behind the scenes before the information gets to them. It's a lot to take on and a lot to keep straight, it seems like. But, every day there's something new, it seems like. So I think we're all just trying to keep up and see what we can do. But, we appreciate everything that you guys are doing over there.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the things that folks often don't think about, especially all over the country, is the staff turnover in these congressional offices is incredible. I mean, there's often times where you have an ag staffer in a congressional office you've built a relationship with, 3 months they're gone. So now you have a new ag staffer come on. You're trying to teach them about federal marketing orders, these complex ag policy issues. By the time you even get like an inch deep, they're already moving across. So that's why it's been very important for us, especially on the economics team. We do our market intel analyses, which really try to take complex issues and digest them down into something shorter, easier to understand, with some pretty charts, so that folks can read those, understand the issue, understand what matters to our farmers and ranchers, and then really take away what our priority is there. And those have been vastly helpful sharing on the Hill with those new staff. But it's really detrimental of how much institutional knowledge we've lost up on the Hill, and even within some of our trade associations, because folks just don't know how a lot of these policies work, how the programs work, and that sets us back pretty far in being able to revamp those programs. So it is a heavy lift. We're working hard to try to educate, and we hope that folks on the Hill are receptacle to hearing more and learning more. And it always helps when folks come from the countryside, all the farmers and ranchers who come to DC and go up to the offices. Those visits mean a lot more than when we send them an email with some charts and stuff. But it really is a group effort at trying to get this education across.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to Danny Munch for joining us today. We really appreciate all your time and all your effort working there in DC, for our farmers and ranchers doing that critical work. We appreciate your time very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Obviously, so happy to work for an organization that supports y'all, out there every day working the land. And I always love to come out to Arizona. I've had the opportunity to come to a couple of Arizona Farm Bureau's events, and look forward to the next time I'm down there.
Absolutely. Join us anytime. Well, if you guys are looking for Danny's market intel reports, they can be found at fb.org. Also, links are available on our website, maricopacountyfb.org. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this week to Arizona Agriculture Connection, and we will catch you next week with a new ag report. Thank you for tuning in today, and remember, Farm Bureau has a place for you. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your friends on socials. You can also visit our website, maricopacountyfb.org, for more information and to submit a topic you want to learn about. Remember to tune in every Wednesday wherever you listen to podcasts. A huge thank you to Paloma Ready Mix and Materials for supporting our agriculture producers and this podcast. Maricopa County Farm Bureau, bringing you the stories of real families, real farms, and real food. I'm Nicole Clements, signing off. Catch you next week.